Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today on International Women's Day to talk about Licoricia of Winchester. I'd like to just thank Hampshire County Council for inviting me today and for hosting this event, and to everyone at the ARC, especially Kate Rosie, who's organised all the logistics of it, and to the Licoricia of Winchester appeal, of course, without whom I wouldn't have written this book and I wouldn't be here today. So International Women's Day, I've sort of been thinking about the purpose of it and the theme of it. The theme this year is Break the Bias. And International Women's Day really is a kind of check-in, isn't it? It's an annual check-in to see how we're doing. And I have to say, looking back on the last year, I couldn't find much cause for celebration when I was thinking about this yesterday and today. And here in the UK, the pandemic has had a really terrible financial impact on women and has also led to a dramatic surge in domestic violence. The murder of Sarah Everard, meanwhile, has exposed entrenched misogyny and sexism in the police, and the vast majority of cases of sexual violence we've recently heard go unpunished. I'm not going to dwell on that dismal portrait, but anyway, looking beyond England, though, what I see are women in flight from pressing danger in Syria, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, and now in Ukraine. Women of all ages, with their children, risking everything to flee from senseless violence, forced to leave everything behind, homes, communities, friends and family members, their lives needlessly ripped apart by the political agendas and territorial ambitions of, let's name it, greedy, ruthless, power-crazed men. So if we want to find an embodiment of the essence of toxic masculinity, we can just look at Putin. But very sadly, he's not alone. Now, we may think that such appalling scenes, women and children driven from their destroyed homes, could never happen here in Britain. But they could, and they did. On July the 1st, 1290, the King of England, Edward I, issued a decree of expulsion. And the people being expelled were the Jews of England. It was a reasonably small number of people left by then, only about 2,000. It had been a much bigger population, but it had been subjected to kind of decades of persecution, and it was quite reduced by this point. But in any case, on July the 1st, the king issued this decree saying by November the 1st, All Saints' Day, all the Jews of the realm must be gone on pain of death. And that's exactly what happened. There were dismal scenes of hundreds of Jewish women and children and their few remaining men carrying only what they could carry, crowding onto boats at the docks, fleeing the country on pain of death. The whole story of Licoricia is a kind of extraordinary tightrope walk between inspiration and warning. And I'm going to touch on both today. Sorry, I'm taking my paper clip off first. So one of the things that happened next was the king had ordered safe passage, and this as well is something that kind of just feels very resonant to what's happening with these apparent safe corridors today in Ukraine. So they had been promised safe passage, and the king had said no one was to harm the Jews in their departure from the country. But in fact, in several cases, the desperate and terrified passengers were murdered by the crew of the ships which they were leaving in, and they were robbed of what meagre possessions they still owned. So, you know, history just kind of repeats itself in the most terrible way. And the expulsion was the first time that a sovereign realm had expelled its entire Jewish population en masse. And that was England set the path for that. And it brought to a shameful end 200 years of Jewish life in medieval England. Which brings us to Licoricia. Born at the beginning of the 13th century, she was without question one of the most extraordinary members of the medieval Jewish community in England. Her life spanned 7 decades, 2 civil wars, 3 monarchs. She was married twice, widowed twice, and she was the mother of at least 4 children, probably 5, possibly more. She was an inspirational example of a smart, determined, fearless individual. She overcame seemingly insuperable odds to become one of the country's most successful financiers and the country's richest Jewish woman, despite the fact that she was a woman in a rigidly patriarchal society, despite the fact that she was a Jewish woman in a Christian country deeply and often openly prejudiced against Jews. So if ever there was a candidate for a person who broke the bias, the theme of this year's International Women's Day, it is Licoricia of Winchester. As a medieval woman and as a medieval Jew, she broke the bias in so many ways and so many times, over and over again, in fact, during the course of her long and dramatically eventful life. Now, history, of course, is densely populated with overlooked and forgotten women. But the life of Licoricia of Winchester is not just worthy of attention for its historical interest, although it certainly is historically interesting, but it's also a story with great relevance today, a story that throws light on how we think about and treat immigrants and refugees in this country, and a story that reminds us of England's role in creating one of the darkest and most enduring forms of prejudice, the poison of anti-Semitism. So, who was Licoricia of Winchester, and why does she matter? I suspect I'm talking today to a kind of an audience who know more about Licoricia of Winchester than most people, but I've been quite struck in the last few weeks with the unveiling of the statue, how many people who I've known for a long time have come up to me and said, actually, I'm from Winchester and I'd never heard of Licoricia. So even in Winchester, she hasn't been a terribly well-known figure until very recently, and beyond, that's even more the case. And yet, as I said, she was one of the most important people, and definitely the most important woman in medieval England. Now, as her toponym suggests, Licoricia spent most of her long life here in the royal medieval city of Winchester. She moved here as a young woman in around 1215, sort of around 1215-20, and she died here on Jewry Street, brutally murdered in her own home one spring morning in 1277, when she was probably in her 70s. Although almost unknown today, Licoricia was, in a nutshell, hugely important. Born in the early years of the 13th century, she rose from obscure origins to become the most successful female financier in England and the darling of Henry III, no less. She first enters the historical record in January 1234, when she's described as Licoricia, who was the wife of Abraham of Kent, i.e. she was a widow at that point. So by the time she's in her early 30s, she was a single mother with 4 children. But here's the really interesting thing about her. She was already making loans at a significant level at this point. She was already a successful businesswoman in her sort of mid-30s. The earliest documented evidence of Licoricia's business activities record that Petervan and Licorice, Jews of Winchester, were ordered to let a certain Hugh Sansever off paying the interest on the £10 they'd lent him. Now, £10 may not sound much to you and me, but in the 13th century, at that point, £10 was enough to buy a brand new, fully fitted ship. Okay, it was a huge amount of money. So she was already making a significant loan. And a second mention of her in the same year records that a William of Hampton, the old name for Hampshire, owed her 10 marks, which he was ordered to repay at the rate of 2 marks a year. So you can see how, on one hand, sometimes she's having her debts cancelled, and on the other hand, sometimes she's having them enforced. And that gives you a sense of kind of just what a precarious world being a moneylender was in the 13th century. Nevertheless, by the end of the decade, so by the end of the 1230s, Licoricia was a regular at the Royal Court of Winchester in the castle, and she was enjoying considerable success as a businesswoman, working in the upper echelons of society as a banker to senior clerics, including the Bishop of Winchester, members of the nobility, and the royal family, including the king himself. So she was a serious operator already by that point. Now, a word about moneylenders. Despite the caricatures, most Jews in medieval England were not rich. Most of them were not even well off. Most were as poor as everyone else, and most people were dirt poor. Moneylending was not a meal ticket to great wealth. Half the Jewish population at any one point were too poor even to pay taxes. Most Jews weren't moneylenders, and most moneylenders weren't Jews. And I'll just leave that to sink in a bit, because it's actually quite a challenging idea, because it goes against an ingrained belief that's been in place for hundreds of years. I'll just say it again, most Jews weren't moneylenders, and most moneylenders weren't Jews. Only around 10 to 15 people at any one point, Jewish people that is, were making any real wealth through loans. In a pre-banking world, moneylending was actually an essential part of the medieval feudal economy. I mean, it was the cash point machine, it was the credit card, it was the bank account, it was everything. It was anything that needed money required money lenders, fundamentally. So Christian money lending was strongly discouraged. And from the 13th century on, the early 13th century on, the century in which Licoricia lived, it was really actively, there were sort of active constraints on Christian money lenders. One of the main ones was that they couldn't give their wealth to their heirs. So there was no point building up a great sort of fortune from money lending because you had no one to leave it to. So that was a serious sort of disincentive to go into money lending if you were Christian. And there were a whole raft of things which were introduced to do that. So the role of moneylender increasingly fell to Jews who were themselves used ruthlessly to advance Christian ambitions. Ambitions for land, ambitions for power, ambitions for property. So all of which had relied on moneylenders, but really the Jews were kind of used by the Christians for the most part to serve their own ends. The situation in the 12th century is slightly different, and in fact, the Jewish population in England had, I'll say a bit, if you like, if you're interested, about where they came from, but the Jewish population in the 12th century in England had actually, it flourished, really. So you have a sort of rise of sort of success as a community up to the beginning of up to the end of the 12th century, and then things slowly get worse and worse in the 13th century. So for individual moneylenders, even those at the very top of the game, like Licoricia, money lending was always a high-risk enterprise. Fortunes could be wiped out in a second through swingeing taxations on the Jews, known as tallages, and loans could be cancelled by the Crown without warning. Assets, property, and bonds could be confiscated at a moment's notice. Aaron of York, who was one of the wealthiest Jewish magnates in 1241, had been bankrupted by 1255 as a result of the king's demands. And the family of another leading Jewish magnate, Leo Episcopus of York, was likewise ruined in 1244 by the vast fine of 7,000 marks imposed on his heirs after his death. In addition, the top-level bankers like Licoricia, navigating the snake pit of political rivalries, royal scandals, and repeated territorial conflicts which characterized the 13th century, made life extremely precarious. Yet despite these obstacles, by her mid-40s, Licoricia was established as one of the country's top financiers, the richest Jewish woman in England, with business interests extending over many counties in the south of England, properties in Winchester, Oxford, and other towns and cities, and considerable status, power, and influence as a result. She was extraordinary. She was just quite simply extraordinary. She must have been an extraordinary person. As a woman and as a Jew, she achieved all of this in the face of insuperable odds. But she was also typical. She was typical in the sense that she was no different from the rest of the Jewish community in 13th century England in her vulnerability to the anti-Jewish restrictions and legislation, prejudice and hostility, and not infrequently violent attacks and wholesale massacres that characterized the 13th century. Her life from start to finish was one of spectacular highs and lows. So to give you a little bit more of an insight into her life and what I mean by these spectacular highs and lows, I've mentioned already that she was a widow by 1234. She probably married at around the age of 15, which was quite normal at that time. So let's say she was married. We don't know exactly when she was born, so we're sort of working backwards from when she had her last child. Age of menopause hasn't changed much in 800 years. So we're kind of working back from, we know when she died, we know when she had her last child, her youngest child. So from that, I think she was probably born at the beginning of the century. So she married about 1215. She moved to Winchester not long after that with her husband. She was widowed by 1234, but widowed how? And widowed exactly when? Well, we know she was widowed by 1234, but we also know something else, which was that in 1225, so 9 years earlier, her husband, who was called Abraham of Kent, was arrested and accused of murdering a Christian child. These accusations of ritual murder had basically been invented in Norwich in 1144 in the very scandalous case which we know now as William of Norwich, where a teenage boy was killed and then sort of subsequently became sort of martyred. In fact, the case proves that he wasn't killed by the people by the person who was accused of killing him, who was Jewish. It was something quite different. But these accusations of that Jews killed Christians to use their blood in Jewish rituals became entrenched and was a kind of repeated trope that kind of occurred, and wasn't just a trope. I mean, it led directly to the deaths of thousands and thousands of Jews in England in the 12th and 13th century, but then in the course of the next 800 years in Europe. So this was a very serious and devastating moment. To have your husband arrested and accused of a child murder was really, you knew it was bad, really bad. But we don't actually know what happened to Abraham. We know he was found guilty, but there's no record of his execution. Very likely, given that he was found guilty, he would have been executed, and very likely his property and chattels would have been confiscated. So in all likelihood, at some point between 1225 and 1234, Licoricia was not only widowed, she was also rendered destitute. So how then is she in the position to be making really significant loans in 1234? Well, I'm afraid to say, folks, the answer is we don't know. Because what we do know about Licoricia comes from the financial records of things that did happen. So there are lots and lots of blanks, which of course makes it interesting in lots of ways, because it's very tempting to kind of speculate and think, what was going on. One possibility is that in her ketubah, her wedding contract, money had been set aside for her in the event of widowhood, which we do know happened. Another thing that might have happened is that another very important Jewish woman financier called Cara of Winchester, who was then a kind of grand matriarch and kind of towards the end of her life, and who was significantly wealthy, she may have helped Licoricia. It was a small, close-knit community, so she may have come to her aid, or Licoricia may have borrowed money from her, and agreed to kind of pay it back as she could. I kind of always think about the story of my great-grandfather who arrived from Romania in England as a young man, with nothing apart from, apparently, the family legend goes, the silver candlesticks for Friday night prayers. And apparently he used to pawn them out on a Monday, he used to sell them on a Monday, use that money to buy wood to make commissions for people because he was a carpenter, and then buy the candles back on a Friday night. But he ended up owning White City Stadium and he used to have his Friday night dinners apparently in the Savoy Hotel. I mean, his children spent it all, so it's classic rags to riches and back again story, sadly. But anyway, but the point is that actually you could get yourself launched like that, and you could, and people did and still do. So maybe that's how Licoricia did it. We don't know. In any case, what we do also know is that by the time we get to the 1240s, so she's been a single independent businesswoman for probably, well, let's say sometime between 1225 and 1234, so a good 10 years by this time, she decides to remarry. So independence is quite a good thing for a Jewish woman. It's not the same as for Christian women in the 13th century. Jewish women had quite a lot of freedom to do what they wanted, and being widowed wasn't necessarily an impediment to be successful in business, and in Licoricia's case it clearly wasn't. But so in the early 1240s she decided to give up her independence to marry. Now the only real reason for doing that would be that marriage was a strategic advantage to her. Enter into the frame David of Oxford, erudite, extremely rich, very powerful, one of the leading magnates in medieval England. I'd like to think he was also really handsome, but who knows? They certainly made a bond. He had been born and raised in Lincoln, but he was so successful even by 1216, when Licoricia was probably getting married, he was a bit older than her, that he'd moved to Oxford and changed his toponym from of Lincoln to of Oxford. He was already acting as a personal financier to the king when he met Licoricia, and to the king's sister, Eleanor de Montfort, Countess of Leicester. David, in short, was a catch. Wealth, status, brains, and as I said, probably good looks. But so was Licoricia. Licoricia was a catch because what David didn't have was an heir, and Licoricia had 5 children to her name. So, power couple in the making. Soon enough, they decided they're going to get married. They probably met, let's just say a word about this, they probably met in 1241 at the great Parliament of the Jews in Worcester, which was called by Henry III to enforce payment of his latest Jewish taxation, massive taxation. A proclamation went out to the sheriffs of Nottingham, Cambridge, Lincoln, York, Bedford, Norfolk, and Suffolk, threatening them with dire consequences if the Jews failed to attend. And I thought I'd just read you a tiny bit of this proclamation to just give you a flavour of just how much power the king had and just how low down in the pecking order the Jews were, even if they had the wealth of the kind that David had. So the proclamation went out, said, the king to the Sheriff of Northamptonshire, greetings. Which I always think is a bit like those emails we start with, hello, hope you're well, before you deliver some bad news. We command you, as you love yourselves and all yours, and so that we do not most grievously seize upon you by force, that you cause to come before us at Worcester on the Sunday next before Ash Wednesday 6 of the wealthier and more powerful Jews of Northampton, and from each town in your shire in which Jews dwell, 1 or 2 Jews according to their numbers, to treat with us of their utility as of ours, knowing that unless these Jews come at the aforesaid time, we will so aggrieve you in consequence by your body and by your chattels, that you will forever feel our hand to grieve you immoderately. It's not really the kind of people can ignore, is it? Sure enough, there were well over 100 representatives of the Jewish community, and they sort of thrashed it out who was going to pay what. And I won't go into it now because it's a bit sort of detailed, but it was actually quite an important moment in terms of making sure that taxes were paid more fairly by the Jewish community. But it also worked as a census, which meant that the king now knew exactly where the Jews were, what they owned, who owned what, and how to use them to get money from them whenever he wanted. Anyway, forget the king and his machinations. Let's go back to Licoricia and David. So they have decided to get married, and it's all looking great, and they know they're going to absolutely consolidate both their positions. It's going to be fantastic. But there's one major problem. David's already married. And in Jewish law, you can't, at that point, you couldn't divorce your wife without her permission. And Muriel, David's wife, was not going quietly. She was, like all good spurned women, going to put up the biggest fight she could possibly put up. And what she did was she said, over my dead body, David had gone to the Beth Din, which is the Jewish governing council in Canterbury, and had persuaded them to give him permission to get this divorce. Muriel, we don't know when she heard this news. Maybe that was the first she heard about it, But at that point, she absolutely kicked off. She got all her friends and allies in Lincoln, which was where she was originally from, and she persuaded them to go to the Beth Din in Paris, which was sort of higher than the English Beth Din, and persuade them to overrule the divorce. So you've now got this kind of major fight going on between the English Beth Din and the Paris Beth Din. But then it looks like checkmate for Licoricia and David. But then David and Licoricia, whatever, one of them, both of them, together, singly, we don't know, decided to up the ante, went straight to Henry III and pointed out to him probably that, really it was a bit odd to be letting the Jews of Paris dictate what the King of England could do with his subject Jews, and also possibly pointed out that if the Paris decree was allowed to stand, then if David ignored it and went ahead and married Licoricia, then the Paris Jewish community would be entitled to confiscate all of David's wealth. And as I've said, he was one of the leading magnates in the country. So anyway, cut to the chase. The king immediately takes action, sees which way his interests lie, and issues a proclamation saying Muriel and her supporters must cease and desist, and they will be arrested if they don't, and that David must be allowed to divorce and marry whoever he pleases. So Licoricia and David promptly marry without delay, and she moves to Oxford, where she is now living in great splendour in David's mansion in what's now the site of the town hall in Oxford. And you can actually, if you go there, you can go down into the basement and see the beautiful Norman vaulted basement ceiling of the basement of what possibly was actually their house. We know that's where they lived, so it's very probable that's what you're looking at. She was now the first lady of one of England's oldest and most securely established juries. Like Winchester, Oxford was a city with a strong royal presence, a castle, and a mint. And I say more about the kind of the Jewish Oxford in the book, but I won't go into that now. But then anyway, so things were going very well for Licoricia, and within a year of the marriage, she'd given birth to the heir that David longed for, a little boy called Asher. And life was sweet, basically. And then disaster. David dies after only 2 years of marriage. He's probably quite a bit older than her, probably under a lot of stress doing the job he's doing. He dies. And Licoricia now faces So she's widowed again. She now faces an even more serious problem than she did the first time she was widowed. So the first time she was widowed, she faced the problem of having no money, no property, nothing. The second time she's widowed, she faces the problem of having far, far too much money. So, as I've mentioned, you had to raise the situation in the 13th century was where when someone died, their heirs had to pay a third of the value of the estate to the king, to the crown, in order to keep the remaining 2/3 of the estate. Now, in the case of David, this was a colossal sum of money. So records of Jewish bonds were kept in what things called arkas, which were a community chest. When David died, all the arka chests in the country, all the cities in the country were seized and closed, sealed, and taken to London to assess the value of his estate. Licoricia was arrested promptly and taken as prisoner to the Tower of London, where she was held hostage for the next 9 months. 9 months. She had a 1-year-old son at this point. We don't know whether he was with her or not. And what was happening during those 9 months was that she was probably negotiating with all her skill and tenacity and charm. I imagine she was very charming to get on as well as she did with the royal family. To be able to, so some kind of deal, which was not going to be a third of David's estate, but was going to entitle her to keep what remained of his estate. So it must have been a fairly fraught 9 months for her, but in the end, she managed to broker an astonishing deal. The deal was that the price of repurchasing David's estate was set at 5,000 marks. Now just remember that 100 marks was enough for a ship. This is 5,000 marks. So we're talking, equivalent of millions and millions of pounds. Of this, 4,000 marks, so the 4,000 per 5,000, were earmarked specifically for the building of a chapel at Westminster Abbey to house a lavish shrine to Edward the Confessor, whom Henry III was obsessed with and had recently made his patron saint. Licoricia was also ordered to pay an additional sum of £2,500, or 1,700 marks, as a personal contribution to the new chapel. So there was a kind of official payment, and then there was a kind of, sort of an additional little sort of personal sum. What did she get in exchange? She was let off taxes for the rest of her life. So taxation was one of the main ways, heavy taxation of everybody in England, but specifically heavy taxation of the Jews was a really fundamental way in which the king levied money for any of his projects. He wanted to renovate the west wing of his castle in Winchester, tax the Jews. He wants to fund a crusade, tax the Jews. He wants to, have a little kind of fight with the French, tax the Jews. It was basically a way of levying money whenever the royal coffers needed replenishing. Now, everybody got taxed, as I said, but the Jews paid, I think they were 0.25% of the population. I'm not quite sure, my stats aren't very good, but they paid something like 25% of the value to the treasury. So they were paying massively over the odds. And as I said, the majority of the Jewish population were actually very poor. So you can see the kind of burden that fell to people, the wealthier members of the Jewish community. So to be let off taxes for the rest of your life was a pretty amazing and very astute deal on Licoricia's part. She was released from prison from Tower of London in 1244, I believe, 1245, and she returned to Winchester, fully independent, extremely wealthy. She now had David's assets combined with her own, and was reunited with her family. And she spent, as far as we know, she spent the rest of her life living in Winchester. The problem, this should have really been her heyday, but the problem was that England was becoming an increasingly hostile environment for the Jews. And I use that phrase really advisedly because there are so many similarities with what happened to the Windrush generation. The Jews came to England in around 1070 as immigrants, welcomed immigrants, and they left as persecuted refugees. It's a terrible story, really, and it's a kind of quite a big wake-up call, I think, for us, because we all like to think we're terribly tolerant in England. The history doesn't go with that narrative. So throughout from the 40s and 50s on, these taxations are getting worse and worse and worse, and many communities are destroyed, many individuals are destroyed. Licoricia, as we've said, has no taxation to pay, no taxes to pay, so she's personally safe, but the Jewish community is increasingly imperiled. I mentioned that David was making loans to somebody called Eleanor de Montfort, who was Henry III's sister. Unfortunately, Henry III's sister, Eleanor, was married to his greatest enemy, Simon de Montfort. And Simon de Montfort led the rebellion against Henry III. And in 1264, this erupted into a full-scale civil war with the Battle of Lewes, when Henry III, Licoricia's patron and protector, was deposed. In fact, he was imprisoned in the house of his sister, Eleanor de Montfort. But anyway, I won't go into sort of 13th century politics at the moment. So the civil war officially ended a year later with the Battle of Evesham, when Simon de Montfort in turn was killed, hacked down, dismembered, castrated. I mean, any humiliation they could visit on his body, they did. And the king, in theory, took control again, but he was really a puppet king with very, very compromised power at that point. Now, the Civil War, the years leading up to the Civil War itself and the years afterwards brought immense suffering to the Jewish community in the whole of England. Jewish homes were ransacked. Many individual Jews lost their lives. In 1264, in the week running up to Palm Sunday, a supporter of de Montfort led an attack on the London Jewry, even more deadly than the attack on York in 1190. According to one chronicler, all the property of the Jews was carried off. As many Jews as were found being stripped naked, despoiled, and afterwards murdered, to the number of more than 500. Those who survived were saved by the justiciars and the mayor, having been sent to the Tower before the slaughter took place. Now, de Montfort was not actually directly responsible for the London massacre, but he was no friend of the Jews. And you have to remember this is a very, very powerful person in England at this point in time. His parents played a significant role in massacres of Jews in southern France as part of their crusades against the Cathars. And in 1217, his mother, Alix de Montmorency, had forced the Jews of Toulouse to choose between conversion, expulsion, or execution. One of de Montfort's first acts on being made the Earl of Leicester in 1230 had been to expel all the Jews from the lands he controlled. He was a zealous Christian with a deep antipathy for the Jews, and he was also influenced by the extreme anti-Jewish views of his spiritual mentor, Robert Grosseteste, who was the Chancellor of Oxford and Bishop of Lincoln, who died actually in 1253, but his influence survived. From 1263 to 1267, the Jewries in Bristol, Canterbury, Gloucester, Lincoln, Cambridge, Bedford, Northamptonshire, Norwich, Nottingham, and Worcester were targeted by violent mobs whipped up by the political tensions, ingrained anti-Semitic prejudice and resentment of Jewish moneylenders. And then the violence came to Winchester. In 1265, de Montfort's son Simon, on his way to help his father at Evesham, paused for 3 days here in Winchester, where he and his men ransacked the town, looted the Jewry, destroyed the Arca chest and all trace of many of the Jews' deaths. Any Jews not safely locked up in the tower in the castle were murdered in cold blood, or as the chronicler Robert of Gloucester put it, I won't attempt to read Middle English, I'll do the translation, all the Jews of the town he slayed each one, and wherever he found them, he left alive not one. All Licoricia's bonds were destroyed. All evidence of her loans were destroyed. This is the modern equivalent of finding your bank accounts being empty behind your back, along with all your stocks and shares and everything else, along with every proof that you ever had a bank account or a stock or a share or anything in it. But far worse, Licoricia only narrowly escaped death herself by fleeing to the castle. Many of her neighbours and lifelong friends here on Jewry Street and the streets around probably died in the attacks, and several members of her immediate family were badly injured. Licoricia seems to have been quite badly affected by the events of these years. She was given permission by the king to travel the country. And again, just think for a moment, a medieval woman travelling the country, that's quite brave in itself. She probably went with a few protectors, but nevertheless. So she travelled around the country trying to find evidence of her bonds in other Arca chests. But she would have been considered quite old by the standards of the day at this point. In 1270, she was probably about 70, very old, in fact, by the standards of the day. She failed to turn up at a legal hearing, pleading she was too ill to stir. Now, this may just have been a delaying tactic, but perhaps her health really was starting to fail by this time. Or perhaps the constant danger and difficulties of being an active moneylender no longer seemed worth the risks, because from this time on, she disappears from the public record. The last mention of her is in 1276, when the sheriffs of no fewer than 7 different counties were ordered to produce the death of Licorice. Anti-Jewish persecution, however, did not disappear. It got progressively and rapidly worse. In 1272, Henry III died, replaced by his brother, his son, Edward I. Edward's mother, Henry's widow, promptly expelled all the Jews from her dowager counties. And in 1275, very soon after Edward had returned from Crusade and being crowned, he issued the Statute of the Jewry, 1275. Very shameful date in British history. The Jews at this point were completely banned from lending money at interest, whether on land or movables, and interest accumulating on existing loans was frozen. So any of you in the room who feel sorry for the Russian oligarchs, again, there's precedent. Totally stopped. They weren't given 30 days notice, it was immediate. The Jews were, in addition, prohibited from pawnbroking, collecting interest on existing debts, and inheriting debts from heirs or tenants. From now on, the king declared, the Jews must earn their living like Christians, by physical toil or trade. Now, in reality, that was a complete impossibility for the vast majority. They weren't allowed to practice most trades, physical toil. Well, if they could, but no one really was interested. So it was basically a way of cutting off their economic livelihood. Many resorted to criminality. Many others just carried on money lending and just hoped they wouldn't get caught. But it was, without a doubt, the death knell for the English Jewry. And from 1275 to 1290, there was a series of increasingly repressive, restrictive legislation, and life just got more and more and more difficult. And in 1278, there was a full-scale pogrom in England. Again, those of you who associate pogroms with Eastern Europe and Russia, there was one here in the 13th century. What it was in theory, the justification was that it was a way of cleaning up the currency, so making the currency to stop the corruption of the currency. Currency was coin was clips. The clips were taken off, melted down, and turned into more currency or plate, which could be sold and exchanged. So in theory, it was we've got to sort this out. We've got to grip the currency situation. But in actual fact, there's evidence that there was quite a systematic undercover operation to gather evidence, falsely or not falsely, against Jewish people particularly. 600 Jews were arrested. This is in a community of probably only about 3,000 at this point. 600 were arrested, 300 were executed. There's probably not one household, Jewish household in England, that wasn't affected, that didn't lose one member of their family, if not more. Amongst the people executed were Licorice's son Benedict and her grandson Lombard. In 1289, her other son Asher, the one who was born to her and David in Oxford, was also arrested, this time along with the entire Jewish population of England, and he was locked up in Winchester Castle. He wrote on a piece of graffiti on the prison wall saying, on this day, he says, that specifies the day, I, Asher, was imprisoned along with the whole Jewish community of England. And this was a precursor to the expulsion. Licoricia was spared the misery of these final years, but her own ending was far from peaceful. One spring morning in 1277, she was found stabbed to death on the floor of her house in Jewry Street. Her Christian maid, Alice Dicton, lay dead close by, murdered alongside her mistress. Both Licoricia and Alice had been killed, according to contemporary accounts, by a blow to the chest made by a knife to the heart. Their bodies were discovered by Licoricia's daughter, Belia. News of the murder was widely reported in England and even spread as far as Germany, because Licorice was a well-known figure. The motive for the murder, however, was unclear, as was the identity of the culprit, even though the two women had been stabbed to death in the centre of town and in broad daylight. Neither the motive nor the killer were ever discovered. The chief suspects were 3 local men, but charges against all 3 were dropped, and the blame was pinned on a Winchester saddler named Ralph Lascilla, who had conveniently vanished without trace. Ralph was pronounced guilty of killing Licoricia and her maid during a botched burglary attempt and was duly outlawed, a hollow sentence since he clearly had no intention of being found. The inquiry into Licoricia's death bears all the hallmarks of stitch-up. It was much less trouble for the jurors all of whom failed to attend the first day of the trial and had to be whipped up to kind of attend. They were mostly local bigwigs. It was much preferable to find a poor, insignificant, and physically absent Sadler guilty than to scrutinise too closely the activities of more influential and well-connected fellow citizens. We don't know why she was killed, and we don't know who killed her. She almost certainly had enemies. You know, she was in a business that invited people to feel sort of hostile towards you. She was also a woman who had defied all the rules, who had defied convention. And also this was a very anti-Semitic kind of moment in British history. So, you know, we just don't know whether it was a revenge killing or a botched burglary or, you know, or what. But it was certainly a very sad end to a very amazing life. Now, like all of us, Licoricia was bound by the dictates, prejudices, and turbulence of her age. She had to operate within the context of her day. But what makes her story so powerful is how it relates to today. The Jews, as I said, came to England as immigrants and left as refugees. They were invited here by William the Conqueror to help him establish himself in trade and finance, because the Anglo-Saxon merchants, apparently we're not allowed to use the term Anglo-Saxon anymore. Early medieval merchants in England didn't want to do business with him. Anyway, they were Anglo-French, and I think there's also something very interesting about that when we think about the situation of Ukrainians, you know, and Putin's kind of claiming that they're Russians, and they're saying, hang on a second, no, we're not, we're Ukrainian. You know, it's a mixed heritage. My grandfather always used to say to me, you know, your grandparents came, you know, my parents, he'd say, my parents came from Russia. And then he'd say, my mother was from Lithuania and my father was from Latvia. And as a child, I always found that really confusing. How could you be from Lithuania, Latvia, and Russia all at once? You know, it just didn't make sense to me. You know, but the Jews of 13th century England, the Jews of 12th century England were in a way in the same boat. Now, Licoricia, when she was born, her family had been in England for exactly the same length of time that my family had been in England. Now, I think of myself as English. You know, I'd be pretty cross if somebody decided to tell me I wasn't. You know, I certainly don't want Lithuanian, Latvian, or Ukrainian nationality at this point in time. So, you know, I think this question of Englishness is really relevant. When we think about the Jews, it's very relevant in terms of the 13th century because they came with William the Conqueror from Normandy. They were French. They were French speakers. Their families were in France. Their communities were in France. They came to England. They settled in England. They had their new families and new neighbours and new communities. But they retained very strong links with France. And of course, the royal family was French. So the Frenchness, which in the 12th century wasn't a problem, by the 13th century became a problem because what was happening in England in the 13th century was the forging of an English national identity. And the French were the foreigners and the aliens and the enemy. So, of course, the Jews found themselves straddling this kind of uneasy, you know, were they English or were they not English? And, you know, how were they seen? The other problem, of course, was like the Windrush generation, they were brought here because they were useful. And when their use had been used up, they were thrown out. So the second reason why I think this story is so important is because the light it shows on prejudice and anti-Semitism in particular. Prejudice towards minority groups, but anti-Semitism in particular. And the long history of European anti-Semitism is crucial to this English history because there are two specific and really pernicious ways in which anti-Semitic myths were forged in England by the Crown and the Church and then exported to Europe. Blood libel, which I've already mentioned, which was the cause of thousands of Jewish deaths over the centuries, made in Norwich in 1144. And also this linkage with wealth and rapacity, you know, the idea that Jews and money, you know, they're all really, really rich. That, you know, we know how strongly rooted that is. We've seen that with the Corbyn graffiti. You know, we see it over and over and over again, the kind of the Zionist conspiracy that Hitler kind of stoked up anti-Jewish prejudice on the basis of. The 13th century, that was a very, very strong trope coming out of England in the 13th century. But as I hope I've given you some indication of today, it was a myth. It wasn't true. It was an anti-Semitic stereotype, which was forged in order to stoke anti-Semitism. So Licoricia does not stand outside of these ingrained and very real obstacles. She found her way in spite of them. To achieve what she did, she must have been an exceptional individual. with enormous skills, both financial and mathematical and diplomatic and interpersonal, but also a phenomenal character. She must have had nerves of steel. She must have been pretty fearless. She must have had enormous chutzpah. I'm really happy to be giving this talk today with the statue of Licoricia newly unveiled outside. I think Ian Rank-Broadley has done a wonderful job of capturing the strength and the vulnerability. The message for me is beat the bias, be inspired. Thank you for listening.
I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Rebecca for this wonderful talk. What an amazing way to celebrate International Women's Day, to think about this woman all that time ago breaking biases that are still around today. So absolutely incredible. Would you have time to answer a few questions? Yeah. I thought I might wander around with a microphone. Will you, if I come and collect the big microphone? Thank you. So, yes. Like to indicate, then I should go and choose the
Thank you very, very much for a really wonderful talk, so well articulated. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone else did here as well. I just wanted to ask a kind of minor point, possibly, which is that you mentioned that the Christians were dissuaded by various regulations from being moneylenders. And yet you also said that it wasn't true that Jews were the main moneylenders, and I saw a contradiction in that, if you don't mind me asking. And I just wondered if you had any more information about that.
Well, so a lot of moneylending was going on at an unofficial level to start. And so up until the end of the 12th century, the major moneylenders were Christians. So William de Cave, people like that. But then the sort of major Christian moneylenders in England specifically stopped functioning in the 13th century, and that's when the top Jewish magnates moved into that space. But they were able to accumulate the capital, which enabled them to do that through the 12th century. It was much more, I suppose, friendly isn't quite the right word, but that there was a more tolerant atmosphere towards moneylending generally in the 12th century, when the Jewish moneylenders accumulated their own capital. But so it was more that the competition was swept out of the way in the 13th century. When I say that most Jews weren't moneylenders, there was a lot of moneylending going on, even so. So the idea of being a banker, I mean, in a way, the word moneylender covers a lot of different roles, from low-level pawnbroking, like, could you lend me a couple of quid so I can go to the pub on Friday night or something, to all the way up to, like, I need to buy, 10,000 acres of land and build a monastery. So we're talking about very different levels, but the ones who are functioning as bankers, that's really a specific function of the 13th century. But even by the 1270s, you've got Christian moneylenders coming in from I think Lombardy and from Italy anyway. And so it's never a clear-cut picture. And what you've got in Europe is you've got a lot of Christian moneylending. I mean, the reason the church is cracking down on it is because it's happening. The church wouldn't be banning something that wasn't there. Again, well, no, I'll stop talking about Russia and Ukraine. Sorry, I'm just a bit obsessed with it at the moment. It's so awful. But a lot of the repressive measures tell us what was in place, and the church's determination to crack down on Christian moneylending was because it was so ubiquitous. So the situation in England is quite specific, and the way in which in England it became a kind of niche activity associated with Jews. That's really the source of this this exported myth that that's all they do and that's what they do, and they're tremendously successful at it. But really, that was a product of England's specific economic circumstances. What you get in the 12th century is you get, Christians and Jews involved in all aspects of financial services. I talk about it more in the book in more detail. And there's certain academics who've written specifically on this, like Robert Stacey and Paul Brand. So if you want to know more, you can. But yeah. Thank you so much. I hope that explains a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Rebecca. That was fascinating. Just a quick one, which was, as far as I understood it, at the time, Jews were considered the property of the king. Now, was that specific to Jews, and obviously smacks of slavery, etc., or was it ubiquitous to all citizens of England?
So that's a really good question. So all the everybody in England was the subject of the king. So everybody was the subject of the king. But the Jews occupied a particular place because they came with special protection of the king. So they had special privileges, which other people in England didn't have. They didn't have to pay road taxes, for instance. They were allowed to travel the king's highway freely. They were allowed to practice their religion without interference. This changed over the course of time. It wasn't stable, but when they first arrived, so they had they were the property of the king in the sense that everything that they owned was technically the king's, which wasn't necessarily the case for non-Jewish subjects. There's a way it's phrased is that they had to be of service. I'm just going to find a quote for you. Somewhere on here. So basically, from birth, every Jewish man, woman, or child had to be of service to the king. That was the expression of service. Service regis. So of service to the king, and if they weren't of service, then they could be logically ejected from the country. Now that isn't actually what happened, of course, but that's how they justified these taxations: is that you're there to serve us. You serve us by kind of filling our coffers. So they had in some ways a privileged position and a protected position, but increasingly that protected, privileged position turned into a kind of precarious, vulnerable position. So it wasn't a static situation. It's a little bit complicated, and there's a lot of controversy about whether they were the object, whether they belonged to the king or not. So there's a big sort of academic debate about it. But certainly the king saw them as his property, and they were there to serve him and his needs. Yeah.
Okay, time for one more question.
Hi.
On the International Day for Women, what about Licoricia as a mother? She was a single mother for most of her life. She's here with her son Asher, sweet man as he was called. What was she like as a mother to her other children? Did they work together? Were they as part of the community, as a family?
Well, so again, we can only conjecture from the financial records, but and from the legal records. So what seems to be she had three sons who were born before Asher, called Benedict, Lombard, and Yitzhak, who was always called Cockerell, and they seem to they all lived in quite close proximity, so they were all living around here. She certainly worked quite closely with two of her sons, with Lombard and Cockerell, and she worked with them they worked for her as her attorney in court cases because she was quite litigious, and they also sometimes went into partnership with her, but mostly what's interesting about Licoricia is she did sometimes work in partnership with other Jewish people, but mostly she worked independently. But we know that they were also working they also had financial businesses here in Winchester and elsewhere as well. So her sons didn't live in Winchester for the whole time. After the Civil War, for instance, two of her sons moved away. But her most famous son was Benedict, and in terms of his public reputation, he was a very successful businessman in his own right. He was elected to the Merchants Guild here, became the first Jewish person ever to be elected to a Christian guild, which promptly sparked massive riots in the town. So it didn't go down very well with the local people. But he got on apparently very well with the mayor, Simon the Draper, I think it's called, Drapier. So we don't really know. I mean, again, Suzanne Bartlett, who wrote a book about Licoricia in 2012, she hypothesizes that because Benedict and Licoricia's other sons tended not to call themselves fils Licorice, so it's the sons of Licoricia, that there may have been some desire on their part to distance themselves from her, and that may have been, maybe they weren't close. Now, I don't really find any evidence for that, because it seems to me that if they were wanting to kind of stand on their own 2 feet and have their own reputation, well, they wouldn't really want to be called, they'd rather be called of Winchester or of something else, or people be named after a man. It's a patriarchal society after all. So it makes more sense that they would want to be called by piece Abraham or whatever than piece Licorice. So it seems to me that actually the fact that there's evidence that they really did stay in quite close contact throughout her life, and after when she died, it was her sons who called for and paid for the inquest into her murder, and they brought the case up again a year afterwards. So I don't think they would have done that if they hadn't been fairly close. So I don't think there's evidence. There isn't hard evidence that they were really close as a family and that she was a really close and devoted mother, but certainly she worked closely with at least two of her sons. Asher seems to have been her favourite, perhaps because he was born at a kind of really great time in her life, you know, in the context of a marriage that she very much wanted. Actually, those kind of gaps are really tantalising. You know, that kind of things we'd love to know. So I can't give you a definitive answer, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and everybody for coming here today for this lovely event. I wonder if I can just finish with a quick question to you about your forthcoming book. If you could just tell us a little bit about when to expect it and how to get hold of one.
Well, so this is the cover, as you see, as you've got there anyway. We're hoping it will be available in sort of April or possibly early May. So we're just it's just in the last stages at the moment. So it's on the way, and I think you can, as you said, you can log interest in the book if you want through Danny Harville. But it will be available, and actually it should be available for pre-order fairly soon as well in the next couple of weeks. So there is an ISBN number, and then you can also pre-order it. So it's coming.
Thank you, that's lovely. And I think everybody saw there's a clipboard over there which will take, if you're interested in field therapies. Sorry?
There's supposed to be a lady.
A space to be, that's smashing, so you'll be able to do that. Thank you everybody for coming today, and thank you very much.